Howdy, and welcome to LeeReads, where I talk about the books I've been reading and enjoying lately. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the books that I read in January, starting with something a little bit different, a graphic novel. A friend of mine lent me the Sandman Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes, because I've been curious about the show adaptation of this series, and actually, Neil Gaiman in general is an author that I've read some of. I've read Good Omens, which he wrote with Terry Pratchett, and I've read Stardust. And since he originally became so well known due to the graphic novels, I was interested in giving the graphic novel a read. Volume 1 follows the story of Dream, and as I summarize this, any giant fans out there, forgive me if I get something a little bit wrong, but the story opens when some people are trying to summon and capture Death, and instead of capturing Death, they capture Dream. They end up being able to hold him hostage for many years, and then eventually he breaks out, and it's the journey of him trying to regain some pieces of his power. I liked that there were the segmented stories that did tell an overall cohesive tale. Some of it was really, really dark and hard to read. And actually the illustrative style of some of them is not my favorite. I tend to get kind of creeped out with certain illustrative styles. But it was interesting how each story had a different artist. And I am going to continue to read the next one, which is The Dollhouse, which he has lent me, and I basically keep it in a plastic bag so that I don't ruin any component of this apparently boxed set. Another book I read, I have finally finished The Burning God, which is the third novel in the Poppy War trilogy. And these novels are so intense and violent that I have to take big breaks between them, kind of like when I read Game of Thrones, just because they're a lot. It's the third book of a trilogy. There would be a lot to summarize and a lot of spoilers, but you're following this character named Ren, who has, over the course of the trilogy, been trained as a shaman, and she can summon the Phoenix God and wield fire, which she does first to try to oppress some foreign invaders, and then to counter some allies that aren't really allies, and then finally to try to win in this civil war as her nation itself is kind of grappling to keep control of itself in a way. Ren is I don't even think you can call Ren a morally gray character. She is violent, she is full of the thirst for vengeance and blood, and part of that is a product of being a shaman, because the gods are not kind and they consume the humans that they use to bring about their power. If it's a vengeful god, the person becomes vengeful. So as you're reading the novel, Ren's decisions make sense from her point of view. It's like, yes, of course this character would do that. But that doesn't mean that I love being in Ren's head while these decisions are being made. However, there are characters around Ren that I really do like. I wanted to know what would happen next. So finally, I know how the trilogy wrapped up. I've heard conflicting opinions about whether people liked the ending or not, and I was satisfied with this ending. That said, I don't know if I will feel compelled to reread this trilogy because it's so violent. Like, I would actually get nightmares from passages in this story. But R.F. Kuang does have an historical fiction coming out this year called Babel. It sounds entirely different. It's from the point of view of an Oxford translator who I think gets involved in some sort of revolution. It sounds really cool, and I'm looking forward to reading what she comes up with next. The next book I read was a young adult fantasy that I thought was fantastic. Little Thieves by Margaret Owens. It's almost like a villain's origin story, or it's almost like the main character is the villain, because this person is very selfish. But it's not like, oh, I'm being evil because I'd like to be evil, ha ha ha. These are the things this character wants to accomplish, and they're willing to be selfish and hurt other people on their way to getting that. At least at first. At the beginning of the story, the character is a thief. There's this magical artifact that has enabled her to take the place of a royal person and steal that person's identity in order to, over time, steal things so she can pawn them off and accumulate enough money to be able to escape. And there's this backstory that's associated with it that is very raw, and you can really understand why the character is doing the things she's doing. But she steals the wrong thing from the wrong person and ends up getting cursed. She has 2 weeks to basically repay the things that she's taken, or her greed will consume her. She will slowly turn into gems and pieces of gold and pieces of precious objects, and she'll die. As she's dealing with trying to break the curse, there is an inspector who has been quietly sent to capture this thief because she keeps stealing from these noble houses, and they don't really want to admit that to the general public, but yet they want this person found. That person is her, and they are on her trail, and they are not as dull-witted as she would hope that they are. So as she's trying to break this curse, she's also trying to not get arrested. Meanwhile, a kind of greater evil overarching plot is unfolding where she ends up needing to work with this investigator to solve that crime. The dynamics between all of the characters were really great. The main character is very witty and quick thinking, but also she is dealing with this traumatic past, and it really talks a bit about how society treats different levels of people. So the story is really getting at something deeper, and it was very well executed and very enjoyable to read at the same time. The next book I finished was Persepolis Rising, book 7 in the Expanse series, 7 out of 9, so I'm getting there, and I've started book 8. At first I wasn't sure what I would think about this novel because throughout the series we're following this main cast of characters, and there are other perspectives brought in to supplement the plot. And the setup of this novel, you have the potential for the main cast of characters, the dynamic to drastically change, and there's also an addition of a long period of time from the previous book, which can always be a little bit off-putting. However, it didn't actually end up impacting my enjoyment of the story because the characters remained true to themselves, getting themselves in and out of trouble. The events that occurred towards the end were really gripping and set up the next novel, and I think the final novel. So I'm getting there, close to finishing the book series. I have finished the TV show though, and I think they ended it in a really great spot. Now I want to rewatch the whole thing. The last book I read was an arc. In my previous video where I shared which e-arcs I currently have, I mentioned that I had already begun The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan, and I went ahead and finished that. The Justice of Kings is the story about a man who is the Emperor's justice. He and his companions travel around the empire, which has fairly recently been united under this emperor, and they hear whatever grievances the local people have. They render judgments and justice, and the justice can even execute people if that fits the crime. The justices also are imbued with some magic from the emperor, such as the emperor's voice, where they can speak in the emperor's voice and it makes the person they're speaking to tell the truth. It's almost like the weirding voice in Dune. Some of them have like a necromancer power where if a person has recently been killed, the justice can speak to them to try to figure out what happened in the final moments to help solve their case. Things like that. So magic isn't hugely prevalent in the world, but there are magic users such as the justice or people who get their hands on these texts and teach themselves, which becomes important in the plot. But the story is written from the perspective of the justice's young clerk who has been traveling with him for about 2 years. They go to this kind of out-of-the-way city and begin investigating the death of a lord's wife and uncover, of course, that it wasn't just the murder of a lord's wife. It was wrapped into something much greater that impacts not just that city, but large players within the empire itself. The new cohesive empire is not nearly as cohesive as the Justice and the Emperor would wish. I highly recommend this one. It has a medieval Germanic setting, like feel to it, but there's also the hints of this magic and the investigation side. And the main character, she's really amusing. She's 19, so she makes impulsive decisions sometime. But as you read the story, you really start to understand why it was so important to be told from her point of view, even though the big player in the story is actually the Justice von Welt himself. Those are the books that I read in January. As a follow-up to my previous video, I've started Archangel. I can't say it. I think it's Russian. Archangelsky. So I've begun that one, and we will see if it ensnares me and I continue reading. Thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to support your local library. Thanks.